Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and I'm coming to you from Cape May in New Jersey, in the USA. My first time being here. I've actually been touring a little bit around the country. I just got back from the Queen Mary, and it was a lot of fun. Today I thought we'd do something a little different. Recently, our friend James Penker from Titanic Honor and Glory has joined RMS Titanic Inc. in an expedition to the wreck of the Titanic. The expedition is an effort to go and map the wreck site in a similar way to what was achieved last year by a different company, but the idea behind this one is to use technology that is really, really advanced and to really get a glimpse at what is going on down there, essentially, and to try and find some artifacts that possibly could be recovered in the future. RMS Titanic Inc. has been good enough to share some interesting wreck footage from a previous expedition with us, so I thought today we could sit back, relax, and go back to the wreck of the Titanic, have a look at this wreck footage, and see what it might tell us about the wreck. So starting off, we've come in over the well deck of Titanic. This was a protected sort of deck, protected in that it was shielded from the ocean at the forward end by the raised forecastle deck, and at the aft end by the superstructure. And here you can see a lot of these cargo hatches. There were 2 cargo hatches in the Titanic's forward well deck. The well deck cargo hatches essentially led down to some of the main cargo holds at the forward end of the ship. This is where you'd get most of the cargo and belongings being loaded during sailing day. This is cargo hatch number 2. You can actually see just draped over the top of it, Titanic's mast has collapsed down during the sinking process and is just hanging ominously over this open cargo hatch. Directly at the base of the mast, there are a number of steam winches, which would have been used to actually haul in lines and operate a derrick. There was a boom derrick that was behind the main mast. This was like a small cargo boom that could be swung out and load, I forget the exact tonnage, but somewhere between 3 and 5 tons of cargo into the ship's cargo hatches. The winches are still there, and you can actually see as well, just forward of the winch, there's this little pipe leading out, which would have provided the steam, fed the steam from the ship's main steam lines into the winch so that it could be operated. The crew would have been really busy on sailing day and leading up to sailing day, hauling in the lines and putting cargo into the ship. So now we're zooming right over the bow of the wreck, and this is probably one of the most iconic spots for the ship, for the wreck especially. We've all seen these photographs dozens and dozens of times. The forwardmost part of the ship is called the prow. What's really interesting about this spot is that this is a very structurally important part of the ship. That's the bow of the ship. That's going to be facing directly into the heaviest of the waves when it's traveling along. It's part of a very important structural piece of the ship called the stem, or the stem casting. We all know that the Titanic has a keel. This is the backbone of the ship, and then the frames come out from the keel to kind of create the rib cage. That's where all the plating would be riveted to. But then at either end, at the forward and the after end of the ship, you would have the stem. And the stem is essentially a very, very strong piece of steel that follows the curve of the bow and the kind of the sharp contour part of the stern there that will, at the forward end of the ship, be cleaving the water in half. This is the bit that the plating is riveted to at the forward end. The stem castings from Titanic were really heavy duty. They weighed upwards of 60, 70 tons. They were cast by the Darlington Forge in England. They were in sections that could be then taken to Harland and Wolff in Northern Ireland and then riveted together to form this 10-story tall bow structure. Of course, this has been made iconic by the film, and at the top of the stem casting sat a sort of decorative stem post. And this is a hallmark of Harland and Wolff's constructions for White Star Line ships. The Harland and Wolff company made ships for a lot of different lines. And so what they would do is kind of put some touches on certain ships from certain lines to make sure they were obviously part of the same company. And so ships built for the Union Castle line don't really look a lot like ships built for the White Star Line, for example. And Titanic's prow, the stem casting and the stem post at the top there, has kind of become this iconic thing, but you can see it on a lot of other White Star Line ships built by Harland and Wolff, all the way up into the 20s and the early 30s. The last one to have a stem post just like this was the Georgic. And so if you punch right in, you zoom right in on a picture of the Georgic, it kind of looks almost identical to Titanic's bow. The stem post that Harland and Wolff designed for Titanic, you can see it, it's right there in the film. It's decorative in a way because it's nice, it's got these beautiful flowing lines and things, but it's also practical because it does 2 things. It's got an integral kind of fair lead, which is a hole essentially designed to be reinforced with a steel structure around it so that you can rig lines through that to wrap around bits or bollards and things on the deck so that if the ship moves, it's not going to snap one of the railings or something like that. So the fair lead is the little bit that you can see that kind of curves out and around at the base of the stem post. But then at the top of the stem post, there's a huge shackle. This shackle connected one of the main stays to the forward mast. So even though she didn't have sails, Titanic still had masts. It looked nice, is mainly an aesthetic choice, but it also supported the cargo boom, some of this like cargo handling equipment, and most importantly of all, the wireless antenna. Because of that massive height that they could be afforded from these masts, hundreds of feet up in the air, the wireless antenna gave Titanic an insane wireless range of somewhere between 300 miles during the day and 600 plus miles at nighttime. So very important to the ship. The problem is you're in the middle of the Atlantic and she's going to be rocking and rolling. And so these masts need to be held down tight. And so they've got these very, very thick steel bits of standing rigging, which are, standing rigging is one of two types of rigging. You've got standing rigging, things designed to hold things in place that don't move much. And the second type being running rigging, what you'd probably use to like haul up a flag or sails or things like that. And Titanic did not have a lot of running rigging. Titanic's running rigging was used mainly for things like cargo or hauling flags, but on a sailing ship, obviously they're covered in running rigging that has to move to get all the sails up. This shackle at the front of the ship was essentially designed to hold one of the main supporting stays that was a piece of standing rigging that was purely designed to hold the mast in place. The mast has obviously collapsed, but the shackle is still there. It's just kind of flipped down, so now it's pointing down at the base of the bow there. You can also see here the very top of the auxiliary anchor, the central anchor, which was the largest of Titanic's three main anchors, with a grating over the top so that crew could easily access the forwardmost part of the ship. Say you needed to put lookouts there, they would be able to get there and stand on a grating without kind of like awkwardly falling into this sort of 2 foot deep well where they kept the anchor in place. So the very, very forwardmost part of the ship, very iconic. Sweeping down the hull, we start to get a sense of the state of the ship. The hull seems to be in pretty good condition. Like this plating isn't being really eaten through too much. It just has these rusticles, these long, like dangling bits of rust hanging from the from almost every surface. There is something really interesting here. You can see these fair leads and rollers. These are essentially designed to take mooring ropes when Titanic is in dock, run them through where the rolling part is, the roller of the fair lead, and then lead that to a big bollard or a bit or something to secure the ship in place. This bit of railing above it is actually portable, so it would be taken off so that it couldn't get damaged. And then if you have these rollers in place, the lines won't be whipping up and down the deck, they're going to be stuck there. At the start of this video, I mentioned I was on the Queen Mary just last week, and there are fair leads and rollers just like this all over the ship at the forward and the rear end. They look identical. So this was a classic piece of Oceanliner technology that did not change, and they kind of actually still use them today. Titanic's anchor crane. This was designed to actually lift the central third anchor and drop it over the side. Not drop it, but controlled descent, but you know what I mean. Because of the impact with the sea floor, it snapped its lines probably and swung right around. And so now it's pointing in the wrong direction, but it gives us a convenient look at how it probably would have looked lowering that third anchor, because they would have just swiveled it around by hand and then used the lines to lower the anchor over the side. It's so weird seeing this stuff frozen in time. It's amazing. Although Titanic was lost in a sinking, Olympic, her sister, had this like 20-year-long career, very successful, and you can't find her anymore because she was scrapped. Whereas Titanic, even though it sank, it's kind of still with us. So we can go down and look at it and it's still there. You can see the forwardmost part of the anchor chains and things with some of the smaller auxiliary chains that were essentially designed to hold the main anchors in place that have just kind of like just been frozen in time. It's just amazing. This looks to be the roof of the officers' quarters area now. So you can see that this is in the vicinity of the wireless room. What's interesting about this space is the ceiling, or the deck head, is beginning to deteriorate, so we can actually see through the deck in places that we probably shouldn't necessarily see. So you can see like into some of the compartments, into the wireless room. You can see the top of what would have been a vent once there over on the left. And also looks to be a decorative window from somewhere in the ship, just kind of lying there. I can't quite see where it might have been from, but it It looks to have a central panel that's just been punched out, so that's just fallen on top after Titanic sank. Looking down through the where the dome once would have sat for Titanic's grand staircase, you can see there's just this like empty shaft leading straight into the center of the ship. A lot of contention over what happened to Titanic's grand staircase during the sinking. There's some kind of weird myth going around that the grand staircase was purely made of wood and just held in place with gravity, which is completely untrue. There was a thick, heavy-duty steel scaffolding onto which the oak panels would have been mounted, and that has almost completely disappeared. You can see some of it at the base there, way, way down deep. But what happened to the grand staircase during the sinking is kind of still a bit of a mystery. It's just gone. This is the kind of view that you'd get from down there, just tangles of wreckage and things like that. And you know, the mission specialists on the expedition are looking for identifiable pieces of the wreck to say, we know where this is or what this is. And that can be a challenge. And you know, sometimes I look at footage and I just think, gee, very difficult to figure out what it is you're looking at. Although here you can just kind of get a glimpse at some frames over there on the right-hand side that have been curled outwards. So it looks like this is somewhere in the hull where the plating has been exposed and ripped off. Maybe what looks like to be some kind of ventilator on the left, just a big tangle of wreckage. That's the interesting thing about Titanic. Sometimes there's just tons of bits of steel that have just been torn apart, and occasionally you'll find a teacup perfectly preserved. This is an interesting spot because this has got to be probably near the breakup point of Titanic where she was ripped up, because you can see on the right-hand side there are B-deck stateroom windows, and these are some of the windows that were unique to Titanic that Olympic didn't have. So that looked to be like the breakup area of where the ship ripped in half. The debris field is really interesting because there's just a lot of nondescript steel that would probably have been a lot more easier to identify decades ago when the ship was kind of newly arrived on the seafloor, but which is now very difficult to find. Here you can see what looks to be piles of coal from where the ship broke apart and just deposited all of that coal on the seafloor. You'll get more kind of solid structures every now and then that are kind of still in place. But one of the things you'll see the most of are these tip basins, which would have been in staterooms. And so these were, instead of having running water or taps, essentially what you'd do is you'd have a basin that could fold out. And this was a lot in first and second class. They had them in third as well, but these ones would be filled with water from a jug or a pitcher, and then you would, wash up. There's this myth that people didn't shower so much or bathe very much back in the day, and it's true in that they didn't take baths because baths were a relative luxury. What you could do is use a basin of nice warm water and use it to wash yourself with a cloth or something. And then when you push the sink back into the cabinet, it would drain with that lip part of the bowl into a tank underneath the cabinet, and that would be emptied the next morning by your cabin steward. So very clever, space-saving bit of design. But these are all over the seafloor because when Titanic broke apart, all of those staterooms were ripped apart and just deposited all of those tip basins everywhere. This is one of Titanic's low-pressure cylinders. So this is the first cylinder head of one of the engines. And there were obviously two steam engines next to each other. And when Titanic broke apart, the forwardmost cylinders in their entirety were ripped off. And so you can actually just see this one intact, essentially, the top of the cylinder. And this is the one you've seen in photographs probably dozens of times because that entire assembly was just ripped off and it just left the aftermost cylinders in place. And it's just kind of lying in a crumpled heap with what looks to be one of the piston rods still attached. It's amazing the forces required to do that because the bed plates of these things were unbelievably strong. So ripping that like paper is mind-blowing. This is looking at the very, very after end of the ship. So this is the stern section. This is what would have been the last part of the ship to kind of go beneath the surface, and the stern is in very, very bad condition. So you can actually see, if we're now looking kind of from the position, basically, of a very famous photograph of the stern of Titanic when she was leaving Queenstown, Ireland, you can see that there's a lot of debris on top of the stern here. So these little things over here on the right, they've been kind of identified more recently as parts of the galley area, so ovens and kitchen cooking utensils and things like that. And over on the left-hand side, you can see essentially the deck plating for that area has just been peeled back and flopped over onto its front. And so there's really not too much that's identifiable here. If you were quick, you might have noticed some of the fair lead rollers that we saw at the bow were also here at the stern so that you could warp the ship in to where it needed to dock. And so there's a couple of identifiable things down there, but it's really a mess. What is instantly identifiable is this shape, this overhanging counter stern section that narrows into this very fine point, which is a really beautiful stern shape. It's called a counter stern or a clipper stern. They were really famous on clipper ships, really famously used, very iconic. And it was just a very elegant style that was ported over for use on Titanic and Olympic as well. The nameplate would have been directly above here, and I think if they punch in really close, you'll still be able to make it out. But of course, the impact with the seafloor has bent the propellers way up. They should be sitting a lot further down, and it's just flopped them up because the ship's impacted the seafloor so hard that it has just been able to bend steel like it's wet cardboard. This shot is interesting because this is a part of the ship where the damage is really, really severe, and it's possibly because of that impact with the seafloor and the violent nature of the stern section's fall. This is the after end of B deck on Titanic's stern. So you can actually make out the windows of what would have once been the inside of the second class promenade, the inside of the second class enclosed promenade. And you can actually just make out this bit of steel that's been bent and flopped around is actually the bulwark for the well deck, which was essentially like the railing, like a solid railing. And you can see the swoop of where it would have just kind of dropped down to that level. You can see it in photographs. I'll flash one up on the screen now. So this gives you a sense of where this photograph has been taken. And you can see that the hull's been blown out, the decks are collapsing, and it's really just not looking like it's in very good shape at all. Yeah, the stern section's gone through a lot of violence, and it's kind of sometimes hard to make out what it is that you're looking at. This is, without knowing where this footage was taken, it's difficult sometimes to make out. This is obviously the stern section still. Here we can see the engines that are actually still attached to the ship. So this is one of the engine cylinders. This is not the forwardmost engine cylinder because we know those got ripped off. So this is the next one along. And you can actually see the deck above has collapsed on top. So over time, the stern section, obviously losing its structural integrity, has collapsed down to about the height of the engines, which were very, very low down in the ship. So that gives you a sense of how far the stern's collapse has gone. But you can see all of the components are still there, just frozen in time. The engine's still standing, stories tall, and the tear point at which the hull was ripped away. This is a really interesting piece of the wreck. This is part of the shell plating from Titanic's hull, the underside of the hull. So this would have been displaced when the ship broke in half. And what's really interesting is it's got one of the gratings for the injectors. So this is where Titanic would be able to draw in seawater from underneath as she was going along, and then use that to essentially turn the boiler water, which was a steam at that point, run cold seawater through the condenser units, and then essentially just turn, with its how cool it was, in pipes. It would then turn the steam that was being run through it after it was finished in the engines back into water, where it would be filtered and then sent back through the boilers in this kind of like never-ending loop of boiler water being heated, turned into steam, run through the engines at high, medium, low pressure, and then brought into contact with seawater in pipes, and then turned back into water again. It just goes around. These injectors were on the underside of the ship's hull, and the condenser water, the stuff that was just used to run through the pipes to cool the steam down, was then just ejected right over the side. And so you can actually see that there's some of the original red paint, the anti-foul, still around it, which would have been the kind of red underside of the ship that was essentially used to prevent the buildup of like marine growth and things like that. And it's really amazing to see an example of original paint just still lying around there. But it also gives you an idea of just how destructive the breakup was, because this should absolutely not be sitting in this kind of position. This should be really low down on the ship's hull, in line with the engine room, and it's just been torn apart and just sent flying by the breakup. The engines, the base of the engines, are really well documented by this bit of footage, which is really cool, because you can actually see the bed plates still in place where the engines would have come into contact with the hull of the ship. It was very heavily reinforced to make sure they didn't kind of vibrate or even drop out of the bottom of the ship. Going through the debris field now, you can see part of the ship's crankshaft. This is actually, it looks like it's maybe still attached to an engine cylinder, I can't tell. But that's been bent, like it's made out of nothing. But this is really interesting. This is a thermotank, and this, again, absolutely just should not be here. This was one of the ones that probably sat up on the boat deck in an exposed position. They're also located down in the well decks, and this is essentially how they got warm air into the ship. You would have had steam pipes coiled up in the unit on the right-hand side there, and the steam would have heated up air that was being drawn in by the fan unit on the left. And that fresh air was being drawn in from outside the ship, run through the pipes, which were heated by the steam, and then blasted through into cabins, which is how they got essentially hot air into the ship in the middle of the North Atlantic. It's really interesting seeing one of these just ripped from the boat deck and deposited on the seafloor. It just absolutely shouldn't be there. This is amazing because this is also testament to the destructive forces at play when Titanic sank. This is a big pile of davits. Davits were the cranes that lowered the ship's boats into the water. And we've seen them all lining the ship's boat deck. They were ripped off, presumably during the sinking, because Titanic's funnels detached from the ship, and the stays and the shrouds, which, similar to the stay I was talking about with the mast, were made out of a thick steel rope or cable, would have whipped up and down the boat deck and just torn anything from its base. And so there are things that would have been mounted really securely to the boat deck that were just ripped off, and so sit now in like tangled heaps at the bottom of the ocean. And one of these is this pile of davits, which again should not be there. I was just at the Titanic exhibit in Columbus, Ohio, and the davits are massive. It doesn't really show in photos sometimes the scale of these things, but here I'll put a picture up now. I'm 6'4", and you can see that the davit just absolutely towers over me. So it's amazing, like seeing these things being ripped into pieces and like strewn all over the ocean floor. It's really spooky, really speaks a lot to how Titanic was broken apart when she sank. Mooring bollards, this is back at the bow section of Titanic. The bollards were also used to moor the ship, so you can essentially run the line, if you wanted it to remain in place, through the fairleads that we were talking about earlier, and then coil it around a bollard, and that would keep Titanic moored where you wanted her to be. And one of these bollards was actually brought up during an expedition in the past, and now sits at the Columbus, Ohio exhibit, and I saw one of those as well. They're really big. I mean, this thing came up to like just around about chest height, or just below chest height on me, and I did not expect them to be that big. There are also bollards just like this on the Queen Mary, so you can go and see them, and they're exactly basically the same. Well, this has just been a little taste test of some of the stuff that is in this footage. There's heaps and heaps more that RMS Titanic Inc. have been good enough to send through, and hopefully with the progress of the expedition, we might be able to get some more and get a more updated picture of what Titanic's wreck looks like today. So I will make more videos. We'll try and make them about 20-30 minutes long, just to give you a brief bite-sized view of what's going on down there on the seafloor with Titanic. Well, I'll keep you posted on what's going on with the expedition. If you want to follow what's going on, you can check out RMS Titanic Inc.'s Instagram, James Penker's Instagram, and hopefully we'll get to see some pretty interesting things in the next couple of weeks. If there's anything on the Titanic wreck that you've always been curious about and want explained, please let me know in the comments and I can include it in the next video that we do in this series, looking at the Titanic wreck and trying to find some interesting things. So as always, until next time, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you then.